Hey y'all, it's Melissa, the blogger at Melly Sews and the designer at Blank Slate Patterns. And today we're going to be talking all about knit fabrics. Now, even if you don't knit, it's actually helpful to know a little bit about hand knitting because it helps you understand how knit fabrics are created and how different methods of creating them result in different behavior from the knit fabrics. So today we're actually going to start with a piece of hand knitting that I did. Now on a knitting machine, instead of needles, what they have are hooks, and then there's a shuttle that runs back and forth carrying the yarn, and those hooks pull the yarn through the loop, but it's still one continuous piece of yarn or thread. This is a knit stitch, and you'll notice that on a knit stitch the yarn is carried in the back of the fabric and pulled up through each loop. Now I'm about to get to the other side here, and what happens then if you are hand knitting is that you turn your project over and you start back the other way. And you'll notice that the fabric looks a lot different on this side because you can see all the yarn carries where the yarn was carried across from one stitch to the other. This is actually called a purl stitch. So to continue carrying the yarn on what is now the front of my work, I am going to carry the yarn in front and push the loop down through. And what that does is that makes sure that the yarn is always carried on the same side of the fabric. Okay, so right now it's my front side, but if I turn it over, it will be the back side. The yarn is still being carried back there. Okay, and you can see it, that those stitches look different. They're kind of like tiny columns of loops. Now this is how jersey fabric is formed. These knit stitches on the front, purl stitches on the back. Let's take a look at a piece of actual jersey fabric. This is a piece of printed jersey fabric. If you look really closely at those close-ups of the knit jersey, you'll see that this side has the columns of looped knit stitches. And if you look at the back side, this side, if you look really, really close, it has the carries of the yarn on this side that you can actually see. You can also notice that one of the properties of knits here is that knit jerseys tend to curl in along the selvage edges. So you can see on this fabric here that on the selvage edges it's curling in, and it curls to the wrong side. That is one way you can tell the right from the wrong side. If you have like a solid yarn dyed piece of fabric, look at which way is it the selvage curling. And in an opposite manner, the cut edges, the perpendicular to the selvage, those curl towards the right side. So you can see how this is wanting to curl back in towards the right side. That is helpful when you're cutting knits, when you're looking at right side and wrong side, but it's not very helpful when you're trying to cut knits. So one of the suggestions that I use is to actually uncurl your knit and spray the heck out of it with some spray starch and then iron those edges. And that will help keep your knit from curling so much. It'll curl a little bit less, and that helps you place your pattern pieces right out to the edges of the knit. Now let's take a look at another different type of knit. This knit stitch here at the bottom, you can tell that it looks different and also that it seems narrower, even though this is the exact same number of stitches that I had up here. What I did here, this is called a rib stitch. So if I spread it out, you can see that what I was doing is I was knitting 2 stitches and then purling 2 stitches and knitting and purling. And then on the back side of those knit stitches I purled, and on the back side of the purl stitches I knitted. What that means is that whether I look at this from the front or the back, it looks the same. You're seeing these columns of knit rows and these purled columns that tend to want to hide in between. So you can see how it's trying to bunch the fabric up. To do this, I would knit 2 stitches, and then I would shift the yarn over to the front and purl 2 stitches. And I would continue that. Because the yarn is getting shifted back to front during a row, not just on the ends of the row, that makes this stitch super stretchy, and it also makes it have a lot of good recovery because it tends to want to close back up to where the knit stitches are all next to each other and they're creating sort of a wavy stitch because of the way it likes to bunch up. That actually actually gives rib knit its stretch properties. So if we look at a piece of rib knit fabric, you can, first of all, you can see that there are those columns of knit stitches that are more apparent than the purl stitches that are kind of hiding in the dents there. And you can look on the other side, and there again, you've got columns of knit stitches, and then you've got little kind of indented rows of purl, or columns of purl stitches. And also because of that, and because rib knit often tends to have a little bit of spandex added to it, this has really good recovery. Recovery means that when I stretch it, it pretty much snaps back into shape and it doesn't keep evidence of my stretching on it. If we compare this to jersey knit, and this particular jersey has a little bit of spandex, so this is going to have a pretty good recovery too. So you can see I stretch it and it pretty much snaps back into shape. Other knits sometimes, like 100% cotton, may not recover as well, and it depends on the quality of the yarn, how tightly it was knit, lots of other different things. But that's something you can check for yourself just by stretching a fabric and seeing, does it snap back into place, or does it sort of, you know, lay stretched out? That would be something without good recovery if it continues to hold the stretch after you've released it. One other property of rib knit that makes it really helpful, and is the reason we tend to use it on things like collars, is, let me go back to my knit sample here. You can see how it tends to want to stay together. So if I stretch this edge, like I have just by creating a different stitch, or if I was applying this rib knit to a neckband, you can see how those extra spaces make it easier for this type of fabric to accommodate something that has different curves, because this curve is longer than this curve, obviously. So when I apply this to a neckband, curving it becomes easier because it will let you stretch more on one end than the other, and it makes kind of radiant spokes with those knit columns. Let's talk about another type of knit here. This is sort of in between a jersey knit and a rib knit, and this is an interlock knit. So if I spread the interlock knit really, really far apart, it sort of looks like a rib knit. But if I'm not stretching it, you can see that it looks the same on the front and the back, and also that it doesn't really curl here. So an interlock knit is made in almost the same manner as a rib knit, where there's yarn going back and forth from front to back of the needle, and you've got knit and purl stitches going on. Sometimes interlock knits, this is a single layer one, but sometimes they're even thicker because they're actually two yarns, one on the back, one on the front, and they're getting interlocked as they are knit together in knit and purl stitches. For that reason, interlocks are actually usually the fabric that I recommend for beginners to sewing with knits. The reason is, since they don't curl, they're a lot easier to handle. They tend to be really stable knits. Like you can see this one, even though this is 100% cotton, this one still recovers pretty well. It doesn't have a ton of vertical stretch, which means you don't have to worry about garments like a dress, for example, getting too heavy and kind of growing on you. And again, vertical stretch is if I stretch the knit this way. And all knits are going to have some vertical stretch. Some will have much more than others though. Again, it depends on the type of yarn, and it depends on how big those loops were. The more tightly knit things are, the less stretch in general they will have in both directions. Now let's take a look at some specialty knits. This one here is called a Nylon Tricot knit, and as you can see, it is sheer, and it stretches both horizontally and vertically. And you might think that all these little holes in the knit were created by using really big hooks or needles as the yarn was getting carried across. That's not entirely the case. That is part of it, but there's another way of forming a stitch that I hadn't shown you yet. I've got a knit stitch, remember, and that's pulling up through the loop. Then I can do something called a yarn over, and literally I'm just going to leave my yarn over the needle and put it back to the back, and then knit the next stitch. And what you can see there is that actually, let me put it down, that creates a hole in the knit between those two stitches. However, it also increases a stitch, because before I only had 2 stitches and now I have 3. So in order to fix that, I would take 2 other stitches and knit them together. And now I'm back down to my original 4 stitches. So nylon tricot fabric is made with a combination of creating those holes in the fabric and then also putting the yarn together to make sure that the number of stitches is constant. And this also, because it's nylon, because it's knit, it resembles tulle in the sheerness of it, but it has, let's see if you can see that, it has a much better drape. Okay, it's much more fluid as a fabric, not so stiff like tulle. So I really like this for things like skirts or dresses where you want that feel of a tulle, but you don't want maybe the volume that a tulle fabric would give you. Here is another kind of specialty knit. This is a sweatshirt fleece. And sweatshirt fleece is actually very similar to jersey knit. It's got those knit stitches on the front side. It's been purled on the back side. You can see it curling towards the right side on the cut edge. And on the back you can see this is kind of fuzzy here. And this fuzzy is actually just those purl stitches that were on the back side. After this fabric is created, these stitches get brushed, and that's what creates this kind of loft and fuzzy fleece on the back side. And you'll notice too that it's knit very tightly out of thicker yarn, so it doesn't have much vertical stretch or horizontal stretch at all. And that again is because the yarn is thicker and it's knit much more tightly. Another interesting type of knit, and going back to our idea about yarn overs creating holes in the knit, this sweater knit has this interesting pattern of holes and knit stitches and where the yarn is decreased, and that's created this lace pattern on the sweater knit. So that's one of the ways that hand knitters use a combination of stitches to create different patterns, and then this is emulated with machine knit fabric to create this kind of knit lace. And you can see that it does stretch quite a bit horizontally, but not a ton vertically. That has to do with the type of yarn that was used on this, and again, how tightly it was woven. It stretches more, for example, in the places where those holes exist than it does in the places where it's just like a jersey knit. That hardly stretches at all. One other type of knit fabric that a lot of people like to use is called French terry. So French terry is, again, these are knit on the front side just like a jersey knit. You can see it's curling to the wrong side along the selvage edge here, just like a jersey knit. But on the back side, French terry has these bigger, more textural loops. And that's created literally by just looping the purl side yarn more loosely before knitting those front side stitches, so that it creates this pattern of loops on the back here, and that's the characteristic of French terry, that it's got this sort of loopy back and then it's got this smooth front. And actually some people tend to like the smooth side against their skin, and then they put the loopy, kind of fuzzy looking side out. It's all a matter of what you're sewing and what your own preference is. So there you have it. From French terry to interlock knits to sweater knits to nylon tricot mesh to rib knit to our favorite jersey knit. That is an overview of different knit fabrics and how they're created.